Communicating the Pentateuch, the Sabbath command in Deuteronomy. While this course is about communicating Genesis, it is important to remember that Genesis is not a standalone book, but the first in a 5-book series including Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. As such, communicating themes from the Pentateuch is an important skill to develop. For the purposes of this example of thematic analysis, the literary unit under investigation is really the whole of the Pentateuch. For a short lecture, however, it is impossible to evaluate all aspects of the theme in question, so I'll be focusing on a smaller thematic unit beginning with the Sabbath command in Deuteronomy 5. The Sabbath command in Deuteronomy is particularly useful to illustrate ways to interpret across the Pentateuch for several reasons. 1. The command has a parallel, though not an identical parallel, in Exodus 20. Number 2. The command references the Exodus event at the beginning of the book of Exodus. And 3. The reference to Sabbath obviously refers to God's rest in Genesis 1. The Sabbath command in Deuteronomy differs from that in Exodus in some significant ways. First, Exodus offers a rationale for Sabbath practice in the pattern of creation. God created for 6 days and then rested on the seventh. Deuteronomy, on the other hand, gives Sabbath practice a specific purpose, which is to help the Israelites remember that God delivered them from Egypt. The Sabbath command in Deuteronomy is connected to Genesis through the parallel command in Exodus 20, and expands on the theme of Sabbath, highlighting additional theological facets of the Sabbath in the Pentateuch. Exodus 20, 8 through 11, highlights the pattern of creation. Israel is to keep the Sabbath because in doing so, they demonstrate their adherence to God's order, as well as proclaiming the continuity between the God of creation and the God of Israel. He is one and the same. Genesis 1:1 through 2:4 illustrates well God's power in creating. The passage also illustrates his wisdom in ordering a world fit for human flourishing. The Sabbath command in Exodus inscribes into the memory of God's people the fact that God is creator and, likely, that God is committed to returning his creation to the state in which it was found on the first Sabbath day. Deuteronomy 5:12 through 15 highlights a slightly different aspect of Sabbath that is connected to God's deliverance of his people. Deuteronomy's Sabbath command highlights a new purpose for Sabbath practice, the remembrance of God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt and the creation of Israel as a nation apart. So we have 3 major references to the Sabbath across the Pentateuch in Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy. How do these 3 references hang together? How do they inform one another? What do they reinforce about who God is, who we are in relation, and how we can live knowing that God is with us? Before answering these questions, 2 points deserve mention. First, let me suggest that Sabbath commands are not dependent on historical Israelite practice. As we consider the Sabbath, in other words, we are not considering how or whether Israel kept Sabbath on the 7th day of every week. There are biblical texts, particularly in the prophets, that demonstrate Israel's unwillingness to practice Sabbath rightly. But, in the context of the Sabbath commands, the fact that God commands Sabbath practice should be our primary focus. In other words, by issuing the command to keep Sabbath in the Scriptures, God inscribes within the text something theological about himself, the revelation of God through the inclusion of a command embedded within a narrative. Second, the Sabbath commands are not necessarily commands that we can apply directly to our context within the church. While there are several different views on whether or not Christians are to practice Sabbath, it is important to remember that the Sabbath commands are part of a broader narrative detailing the origins of Israel as the nation charged with following God and demonstrating God's desire for humanity, as was revealed in the creation narrative. Certainly, understanding the context of the commands in this fashion does not preclude a direct application to the church. We may indeed be called to keep Sabbath. However, we would want to wrestle with the broader question of how Christians are to relate to the law, asking hard questions about why, for instance, we may feel the need to keep Sabbath, whereas we are less likely to entertain a whole year of Jubilee. With those 2 points covered, let's begin to think about how each of the references to Sabbath hang together and inform one another. In Genesis 1:1 through 2:4, the Sabbath stands as the crescendo of creation. God completes all his work of creating, declaring it to be very good, and rests from all his creative work. God does not need rest. He is inexhaustible. God's rest on the first Sabbath is symbolic of the harmony and perfection of the original creation. God has, through his word and wisdom, created a world ordered without flaw. 2. In Exodus 28 through 11, the command to practice Sabbath is rooted in the creation paradigm. Israel is to follow the pattern of creation. The command harkens back to the ordering of the world and to God's sovereign position over it. 3. In Deuteronomy 5:12-15, Sabbath is also connected to the broader concept of God's order. Sabbath is described as a memorial practice intended to instill in Israel an ongoing moment in which Israel remembers God's act of deliverance. Sabbath does not simply entail Israel's rest, but the rest of the servants and animals as well. Unlike Pharaoh, whose kingdom cannot be sustained without unceasing labor, God's kingdom is not sustained by human effort, but by the ongoing faithfulness of God himself. In the references to Sabbath in Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy, Sabbath is connected to God's created order. The references in Genesis and Exodus are relatively straightforward, while the reference in Deuteronomy takes on greater significance as a weekly reminder of the Exodus from Egypt. In thinking through the broader connections within the Pentateuch, then, Sabbath becomes a symbol for God's original created order, as well as a symbol of sorts for the order to which God will restore the world. As we consider who God is, then, we see that God creates and restores the world order. Humankind, particularly those who believe in God, are navigating a world distorted by sin while participating with God in his restorative activity. As we navigate this distorted world, we do so with the knowledge that we are not alone in the world, nor are we dependent on our own capabilities. Instead, we are called and capable of living differently. In fact, part of our participation with God in his restorative activity is to demonstrate to the rest of the world that God is at work. We do so by ensuring that we do not distract the world from God's activity, claim it as our own, or otherwise distort our testimony of God by suggesting that his kingdom requires us to exhaust ourselves, our resources, and those over whom we have supervision in order to sustain life as we know it. As one of the 5 books in the Pentateuch, Genesis does not stand alone, but is interconnected with Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Part of communicating Genesis entails the ability to develop themes from across the Pentateuch and to craft theological messages describing who God is, who we are in relation to him, and how we can live in the light of who God is.